So because permaculture has a primary goal of maximizing the connections and the relations between things, it also opens up a framework for us to be able to think about growing systems and what our relationship to those systems are. And I personally believe that there's so much that can't be seen. It's in our humble presence that all the many magic of nature unfolds. And so I find that it helps to get into a space in your inner self before you go and work out in the garden. And because here we are at the Center for Transformational Practice, where we talk a lot about inner and outer, I was hoping that we could start with a little silence and a little circle. And I'm going to do just a very short guided meditation. And if you don't want to follow along, you can just breathe and sit and do whatever you feel called to do. And yeah, and then we'll get started. And I think that we're just living in a time where people's consciousness is starting to incorporate how we live in healthy systems. And our dominant culture has been going in such a different direction for so long. As people wake up, we're saying, hey, we know there's another way. And so, when these ideas come up and there's energy that coalesces around them, I just really believe it's an idea whose time has come. And in our individual and our collective consciousness, we can, manifest these things. Like as you see here, and like with the apple core, we planted 50 fruit trees around the Upper Valley, and this year we're planting nut trees. And it's really exciting because every step in that direction kind of brings a little bit more energy there. And that is another principle. There's 12 basic permaculture principles. And I'm not going to go over every one in detail. I saw there's a lot of books on the table, and I hope everyone's available to maybe stay around if you're interested in this idea and developing it in community.
From 12:30 to 2:30, we're going to have the first permaculture circle meeting.
Awesome.
So I'm hoping that once or twice a month we'll get together and continue that. Yeah.
And I love that because you see these pockets emerging all over the world that where people are coming together and practicing these principles and doing things like planting trees or a public forest garden or whatever that is. And it ties, I like it because the model of which it's created is also in the framework of permaculture. Basically meaning that one principle we're thinking about is what happens when new connections emerge. So, and by that I mean when we put things together, we are working with nature in a way, and we're actually learning from Mother Nature in the way that these systems naturally occur. So, for instance, we look into the forest, and we see that there are multiple relationships happening all the time, and every one piece of those relationships is serving multiple functions for the whole, and the whole is in turn serving multiple needs for each individual. So that's just a really beautiful concept. There's a lot of mutualism, there's a lot of symbiotic relationships, and so when we start to use a framework that embodies these ideals, we also can be inspired by new ideas on how to put things together. And what that does is it helps us open up our framework so that we don't become too stagnant in our thinking and become, complacent, which is some of the reasons why the earth is in such dire straits now. So it's countercultural, really. It's every little step in that direction towards acknowledging the diversity in life is actually counterculture during the times that we're living in because of the dominant systems. But so one of the principles that we're going to talk about in specific relation to building guilds and mulch rings is stacking functions. And so basically, the countercultural part of that is like in the dominant paradigm, we have monocultures, where you have one crop that's grown on mass amount of acreage. And that is probably the most unhealthy model that anyone could really develop, because there's no diversity in the system. An easy tool to remember and have in your back pocket is any system that has diversity is more healthy. The number of connections directly relates to the health of the system. So the more connections that you're creating creates a more healthy system. So it's incredible. So it's also, I just also want to say too, permaculture isn't necessarily a new concept. A lot of the indigenous peoples all around the world knew this, and they were already working with nature. And we even heard on our planting day where we planted nut trees, a lot of this area was inhabited by the Abenaki people. And they would often do, if there was a butternut in the forest, maybe they'd cultivate around it a little bit. So it's like we're really working with nature. We need to get out of this idea of like fighting against nature by growing systems of monocrops and then hammering it with weed killers and then fertilizers, because nature does that already. Pesticides, yeah, we don't really need those things. In a system that is diverse and healthy, the things that we are trying to mimic would be thinking about what is below the surface of the soil and what's above the surface of the soil, and understanding those things and then doing our best to mimic them in our humble humanness, because we're in the process of learning and listening and opening up to what's possible. So in that process, what we're doing is maximizing the benefits to as many of those systems as possible. So thinking about the soil, the habitat. I heard birds. Berries are like one of the best species for birds. And so I always say for humans and habitat, because we're not apart from the system, we're a part of the system. And the more that we work with that system, the more that we become attuned to what helps it be healthy. So stacking functions is an important one. I'm just going to touch upon a few of the principles. Catching and storing energy, because life just wants to live. And up until this point, sometimes the best thing that we can do in some systems that we have destroyed in monoculture farming, like what we're seeing in agriculture in California, for instance, they're experiencing such amazing droughts that there's thousands of acres that aren't being planted this year. Sorry, every time I bring up the negative thing, I forget my train of thought. It's so indicative, isn't it? You're like, oh, I get it. But I like to talk about it a little bit so that we know how important this work is, and increasing diversity is so important. And capturing and storing energy. And so life just wants to live. And so some of the best things that we can do in certain areas, like what they're saying in the Southeast right now and out in California, is okay, let's just stay out of the system. Let's let Mother Nature do what she can do. And, and there's a lot of things that we can do to benefit the system too. But it's important to acknowledge our relationship when we're involved with growing systems. So catching and storing energy, because biomass and carbon sequestration those are two important things that we really need to be talking about during this day and age, because we know what the situation that we're in because of all the carbon and greenhouse gases, and we know that there's a lot of solutions out there. And then that leads into the other principle, which is that the problem becomes the solution. And I think that this is an opportunistic ideal. And it doesn't always have to it used to be kind of like the number one principle for me. And what I find is that I work with one principle for a little while and then it kind of shifts and I think about another one, and of course they're all related. But it's opportunistic in that it helps us think about how to create the solution that will maximize the health of the system. But there's certain problems out there that we certainly don't want to just be oh, it's okay because it's going to help us create a solution. It's just more of a framework to help us have some reflexive thinking about what might be possible. We'll talk more about the different principles as we go on, and if there's any questions at any time, just ask. And then there's the ethics and the principles, and then the other ones there's 3 ethics, which is earth care, people share, and earth care, fair share, and people care. So it's thinking about all the things in the system and the health of those things, and equity, because we see in nature the amazing examples of abundance, and there's no reason that people should not be hungry. if the systems are in place and working well, and if we're thinking about that. And I work with kids, and it's just a short narrative, but I heard this beautiful thing the other day, because they often are worried about having, oh, they got 4 crackers and I only got 2 or whatever, and we started saying, the only time you should be looking at someone else's plate is to make sure they have enough. And I think about that in the ethic related to fair share, because it's a part of it too. It's a part of it too. And food security is is one of the reasons I started getting involved with permaculture, because there was a lot of talk, and then I ended up seeing a lot of examples where you can create a system that is highly productive, that takes little maintenance, and when working with that system, you can become more and more efficient. So each system can increase its productivity and its yields and the health. So just beautiful. It's so inspiring. Okay, enough talking about that, right? I think one time it's like you never lose from waiting, whether you're talking about money or experience or whatever it is. And I really appreciate that, because slowing down and opening up can often be better than, and I speak from experience, because I just used to do everything I could all the time. So as fast as I could. Quick.
It's
Okay.
true.
So anyway, so as you can see, I have learned a lot from just working with these systems, and it's changed me, in the best of ways. So a lot more, and it never stops. It never stops learning. If that ever happened, it would not be a system that I would want to be involved in. Okay, so observation is key. Where are the birds going? Where are the people walking? Where are the animals moving? And why? Oh, there's shade over there. Or, oh, there's the river over here that we want to go to and swim in. Oh, the kids from the neighbor come over through here. So you're thinking about pathways of circulation and animals and habitat. There's just so many benefits to incorporating that just kind of quiet sitting, observation, contemplation into your daily practice. Outside, if you're working with the landscape, or inside too, same thing. And then what that helps to do is it helps to make your actions more efficient, so that you're making the least change for the greatest effect. Because then you see, oh, if I aerate the soil life will come back this season, as opposed to just, sheet mulching it. It's like a simple thing. It takes 10 minutes and it increases productivity tenfold. Things like that. And it's exciting to be doing that. Okay, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about guilds, and then we're gonna go and look at a guild that we're gonna create today together. So like I said before, and the word guild is referred to as a community of relationships. Human nature doesn't matter, it's just a guild. And so when we're thinking about, if we're planting something, we want to think about maximizing those relationships. And in order to do that, we have to be aware of what is happening underneath the soil, because soil is the basis of all, well, it's not the only basis, but it's one of the primary bases of all life, and in 1 teaspoon of soil, there's more biology than the amount of humans on, like more organisms than on the amount of humans. Yeah, have you heard this too? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just incredible, like a teaspoon of soil. So there's just so much that we can't see, but that because of science and because of experiments, and a lot of people that are working in these fields are coming to understand. And now there's science behind a lot of the ways that people were gardening and growing generations ago. So under the soil, we have a lot of things going on. There is, and when we're talking in relation to plants, we want to think about what it is that we want to utilize in the soil for the benefit of our plants. So that is nutrients, minerals, incorporating healthy soil life, worms, arthropods. And one of the best ways to do that is by thinking about the root development. So underneath the soil, there's certain things that we call dynamic accumulators, or you can think of them as nutrient accumulators, And this is not some kind of like rocket science concept. This is just taking into account that plants take up nutrients. All plants do. There are some that the permaculturists have kind of defined as being better at that. Things like comfrey. Long taproot, helps to break up any hard pan, and draws minerals to the surface layer, where you might have more shallow-based roots that are often associated with annuals. So mixing the functions of these things is really important. So you have the long tap roots, and then you have roots that are spreading. So, there's amazing diagrams in some of these books, and if anyone is interested in seeing them, you see a long tap root, and then you see another root that, is maybe of some herbs like oregano or salad burnet is a new one that I'm really loving and learning about, that have like more of a spreading effect. And then you have the really shallow rooted systems. So thinking about all of those things and the ways they work together. So dynamic accumulators, or we can call them nutrient accumulators, just for our memory, because I love the word dynamic, though, it's just so good. And then there's also insectaries. And these are things that are going to draw the beneficials that will eat the things that are eating the plants. So for instance, aphids. We have a lot of things, when we're going to talk about those things today, like dill, for instance, brings the bracken and wasp that eats the cabbage moth. So, but what I heard from Michael Phillips, who's a holistic orchardist and permaculture enthusiast, an amazing fellow, was saying that we need, the way that we have learned about agriculture is, oh my God, there's a pest. Oh my God, it's eating my plant. Quick, spray it or something, or quick, squish it, or quick, whatever. And you can see how that response limits the relationships. So we have to have some of the insects that eat some of the plants in order to draw the beneficials. So it's about changing our mentality and then being aware of what already occurs in nature. And with any kind of a diverse system, because you're thinking about stacking the functions below the soil and then likewise stacking the functions above the soil, there shouldn't necessarily be a lot of issues around whether something is too dry or whether something is too wet. Because above the soil, we're thinking about planting things that have broad leaves next to things that might have wispy leaves. And then that helps to create some cover, so there's some moisture retention and some weed suppression. And so that all of the so-called problems that we have with growing in agricultural systems, like we have to water every day, or I have to go out and find something that will kill these bugs, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it takes a little bit to get there. So it's just good to keep your mind on that idea, because it helps us get out of that kind of quick response mode when we're thinking about all the different plants and animals in our system. So in any agricultural system, we know that nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus are the three macronutrients that are mostly needed, along with a ton of other minerals. And so nitrogen fixers get a lot of fame in the permaculture world because they work symbiotically with bacteria and pull the nitrogen out of the out of the air, and through the symbiotic nodes on the roots, what they call fix it into the soil. It's an incredible function. So a lot of the things that do that already are beans, peas, legumes, a lot of perennials, a lot of trees. I just heard a little bit about black locust this morning. That is also a nitrogen fixer. So there's just so many things that are occurring, and then just a little bit of awareness, we can start to work in these systems and plant things that will draw the beneficials, help make the minerals accessible to more plants, and fix nitrogen into the soil, which is needed for producing crops. Any questions so far? Simon?
You said nitrogen fixing, so it draws, it brings the nitrogen together, draws it up into the soil, and then if you have a nitrogen fixing plant and you pull it out and remove it, does the nitrogen stay in the soil, or does it stay in the plant?
It is my understanding that it will stay in the soil, but it's the function of the symbiotic relationship is like a consistent. So when you remove the plant, you remove that function. So there might be nitrogen in that soil until it's taken out.
Do you mind if I?
Please. Yeah.
Okay. Nitrogen-fixing plants have a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria in its roots, and you can actually see little nodules on the roots. And those nodules are the colonies of bacteria, and those bacteria actually take nitrogen out of the air. And the nitrogen that's in the air is a very low energy molecule. It's got a triple bond and it's very hard to break. That's why making nitrogen fertilizer is such an energy intensive process. But these bacteria do it so effortlessly. And so they'll take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a form of nitrogen that the plant can use. So some of that nitrogen that the plant can use then exudes out into the soil around, but a lot of it gets captured in the plant itself. So once the plant dies and falls on the ground and then gets decomposed, it spreads that nitrogen to the surrounding soil.
Which is why we turn in cover crops.
Right, right. So, but, and in fact, a lot of seeds don't have that bacteria. You know, a lot of legumes, which are nitrogen fixers, they don't have that bacteria. So you can actually buy what's called an inoculant, and you mix your seeds with the inoculant, and then they will then have much more profuse nodules in the roots.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Question.
And also, I think that different plants vary from what I understand, and some plants, the roots will exude or give off nitrogen much more so. And I've been learning a lot about fungal nets. Mm-hmm. So all throughout the soil, there's tiny, like microscopic, I guess, tubules of fungi that connect the roots of different plants. And so that's why when you transplant something, it takes it a while before it really starts to pick up, because it needs to reestablish those fungal nets. So it's like the fungal nets are like an extension of the plant's root system. And it's amazing, they found that there are trees that are completely shaded by other trees in the forest, yet they still survive because the trees around it are feeding that tree through the fungal nets.
Wow.
So it's really amazing. And
that is another way that permaculture embodies countercultural movement, because it breaks down this idea that it's competition versus cooperation. And as a landscaper and a gardener, I'm always confronted with people when I say, oh, it's a dandelion, we'll leave it, because dandelion is a really great dynamic accumulator. And there's such a belief that they're in competition. And that can absolutely happen, and you can see it easily when you plant your annual seeds and maybe you put too many in one cell and they grow up and then they don't all have the nutrition to grow really big. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's that there's more cooperation occurring in the systems than we realize. And
Dandelion is a dynamic accumulator?
yeah.
Oh yeah, they say to leave them around the apple trees, or at least
Yeah.
leave a certain number
Yeah.
around the apple trees.
Yeah. So it just helps
Incredible.
kind of rethinking how we're using them.
And I mentioned last time, it's an insectary too for pear trees.
Yeah.
Brings in the bees early in the day,
Yeah.
and then as they're closing down the dandelions, the bees are still there to go to pear trees, and they have greater
Yeah.
net accumulation. of
Yeah, but
nectar.
under the trees, is there enough sunlight for dandelions? They really like the sun.
They do well in most
The
soils
outer
I've
edge
seen,
of my
in
mulch
most
rooms, I have
conditions. Yeah.
dandelions in,
I have another question.
So yeah. So and like what we see in nature is that there's never any bare soil, and that's for a reason, right? That we can only surmise, but we can guess and see what the systems, how they're producing healthy systems.
Frederica has a question.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I have a question.
Further down the street, you're probably right next to the park.
The perennials, which are nitrogen fixers, like lupin, should we then plant them in our vegetable gardens and intermix the vegetables and the perennials
Yeah.
all together?
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're going to talk more about companion planting as we go. But yes, so I highly recommend putting, not only because perennials end up developing larger root systems, it's like they're giving structure and bringing organic matter to the soil year after year after year. It's just an example. And then there's like all these considerations. Yeah, pH. And so when I first started gardening, I was like, okay, all of these exact conditions must exist for this plant to live. And that's not actually the case. They're like recommendations that are good to go on. And then, we find, I think that we always need to be experimenting. in our own gardens, with our friends, talking about it. Oh, I tried this and this happened, because that's how we learn. And like what you were saying, by doing, you know, we have to be involved with the system in order for it to teach us and for us to learn and help the system. So, so cooperation is built-in efficiency and productivity. Done. You know, like, all right, I'm going with that one. Energy storage. Yeah, and then I've got a list of plants and that are good for beneficials, and that's what we're going to do a little bit of talking about as we plant some things. And I would say, just lastly, before we get up and move over into the guild area, I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry.
Before we get up, could you just recap the main things you just hit? You said dynamic accumulators, you said insectiaries,
Yeah.
and you said
Nitrogen fixers.
nitrogen.
And mulching plants too, right?
Yeah, and then there's many things that come out of that. So like, for instance, a dynamic accumulator like comfrey, because remember I said we're stacking our functions. So someone, I must have been a Taoist, I think, but said, I can't remember their name, but they said, you know, anytime you do anything, there should be like at least 7 reasons for doing it. And like, you know, in my life, I kind of look at that and I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I've gotten up to like, you know, there's some things it's like, okay, I have 2 reasons for doing this. There's some things that have 3. Sometimes you can get up into the like 7, 8, 9, 10. It's amazing. And so the comfrey like is a dynamic accumulator, and it has good, beautiful, broad leaves that have a ton of nutrients in them that you can very easily chop down and just mulch your area. Hi there.
Hi.
Welcome.
This is Ethan and Melissa,
Hi,
some
Ethan.
longtime friends of mine.
Wonderful.
Who are really interested in permaculture too.
Okay.
So
Awesome. So we just had a little intro. We're talking about some of the plants, the reasons that we want to use the plants, and then we're going to get over and do some planting.
I'm going to have something up on the web soon.
If anybody needs to hydrate, there's cups and tea up in the shade on the patio up there.
Thank
Or you can help yourself to water in the house.
Awesome. And there's also bathrooms in the house. And take care of your bio needs. Okay, so yeah, so there's
Insectiary with the comfrey also.
yes, and an insectary.
right.
So right there already we're at 3 with comfrey.
I have a big
That's
question with
medicinal.
comfrey.
Yep, 4.
I see all the wonderful things about it, but it's kind of invasive.
Ah, the word I knew
It
invasive
kind of
was going to
takes
come
over.
up. I'm
It just
so
takes
excited.
over and it's like
Yeah.
spreading. And
Only if you cultivate around it.
Yeah, so we're going to talk, I want to leave some discussion for like as we're working and talking, because there's just endless amounts that we can talk about, but I really enjoy when someone brings up like this idea about like, what about invasives? And
I know it's a good plant, but it's also
it can take over. Yeah, and we want to be mindful. So, and like what I do when I'm recommending plants to people, I say, oh, this one does, you know, it can spread. You know, but I do think that it's good to think about why we're using the term invasive and where that came from. Because there are habits that plants have in certain circumstances, and some of those habits will change in other circumstances. And certainly there are things that can take over and be really bad. And in bad, I mean maybe they're taking up all the water, and that's not allowing the plants to thrive, or maybe they're choking out every other species, and that is directly going against our principle that we want a practice of diversity. So we have to, so I'm just going to give one quick example of knotweed. It's an invasive plant, right? Yeah. And
we're surrounded by it constantly.
yeah, and like if you are surrounded by it, you're like, I'm not gonna start cultivating, you know. But you'll hear people be like, oh, you know, absolutely, we can cultivate it. We can harvest the young shoots. Our friend Mark Kudulowski was just talking about how he's put up many jars of knotweed. You know, it's a food source that
It is a
grows
food
in
source.
abundance,
Yeah.
and so we just, instead of thinking bad, we can think,
I'm just thinking
What?
foundation of my house. That's
yeah, and that might be
There is
bad for the
bad.
foundation of
There
your
is-
house. I know, it's like every time I try to be like,
and it
I'm
does
like,
have a lot of medicinal qualities too.
it can do
knotweed.
whatever
Yeah.
it wants as long as it doesn't.
Like for
and
fighting
that's
Lyme's-
what I was going to say is that
fighting
for,
Lyme's disease.
so we see an increase in, and as an aspiring herbalist too, this is something I always look out for, because I believe that, like we started this circle talking about relations and connections, right? So when oftentimes we see things emerge in human systems, and then you may just see something emerge in the natural system that can be a medicinal for that symptom. And this has happened on numerous occasions to many people that I know, including myself. And so just be open. Be open to the amazingness that can occur in natural systems, and be aware. And I think with that awareness and with thinking about things like diversity and stacking functions and maximizing yields and building soil and all these things, we can potentially create approaches to things that might be invasive that can help the system become in more balance. So I really appreciate you even bringing up the word balance, because that's a huge part of it.
Right. I mean, I like
And-
having company, but it's like.
Yeah. So, and there's ways, and there's totally ways that we can talk about, that I've been practicing over the years to help keep those systems in balance, so that you're not having a comfrey farm or whatever, or a nettle farm or whatever, because we do want these systems, we do want these things, but there's also concern about things like the sea berry, which is a amazing, nutrient dense, antioxidant rich, vitamin C, nitrogen fixing, but it happens to have the name buckthorn. So it's not in the same family as invasive buckthorn, but it causes a lot of concern because, we have seen things take over. We have seen things take over in our national parks that are big problems. But it just takes having that education awareness, and when someone brings it up, say, oh yeah, that's a really good point. But I know, for instance, that sea berry does not thrive in the shade. It actually dies if you plant it and there's too much shade.
Is that SEA?
SEA berry, yep.
And
then
it's very hardy. It's from Siberia.
Yeah.
So it can handle the cold really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so it's just a matter of, so that's why I was saying some things thrive in certain climates and some things, they don't. And that's one example of that we can help to educate ourselves and others about the fact that, we can help to maintain balance by being aware and then observing. And then the other thing, I'll just say, when we observe, we interact, and then we accept feedback, and then we do it again. So it's a cyclical process. And even with gardening, as you all know, as gardeners, there's always change that's occurring. Oh, we put this here. I wouldn't ever recommend moving trees, but you can say, oh, we put this here. Now it's actually we realize it's going to go here. Oh, these chives are spreading. Excellent. It's a perfect time to create some guilds over here. We're going to divide them. It's always changing and evolving, and that's a part of the. How boring would it be if it didn't, right?
There's a concept in permaculture called succession.
Yeah.
Where it's like the evolution of an area from bare dirt to a thriving forest. It's, you can actually watch the progression and different types of plants. It starts out with pioneering plants that grow really fast. They're annuals, the kinds of weeds that you see in your garden. And then over time, perennials will develop, and then bushes, and then eventually trees, and then bigger trees. And before long, you have an entire forest where there was just barren, so it's kind of a progression, it's pretty amazing. And permaculture, like when you're establishing a food forest, you actually use those progressive principles, and you try to help accelerate those progressive principles. So
Is
pretty neat.
the different reasons that you're doing something and maximizing those reasons. Can we reach that lucky number 7 with all the things that we're trying to do? And this is a really wonderful site and example for working with all those considerations. So in permaculture, when we're creating zones, we're thinking about zones of use. And so I'm just going to point out a few of those while we're here so that you can have more of an idea about what things impact the decision. So what I say, pathways of circulation. Here we're all standing on a pathway that is used by this whole community to access the river and the forest. We also have pathways here and going from the house. There might be future chickens in this area, so this would be if it's something that is visited, an area that is visited every day, that would be considered zone 1. And in the zone 1, you would want to be thinking about stacking all your functions. What do you have to do every day? Maybe you're cooking every day. We all eat, and you want to be able to access your herbs and your salad. So, but you also have to take care of the chickens. So as you're walking to take care of the chickens in the morning, you let them out, you come up with your scissors, you harvest your greens or your herbs for the day, you bring them in. It's built-in efficiency, right? So pathways of circulation, we don't, I mean, I've found that like we don't think about this enough. So the other things is of course light. We know there's a lot of great plants that can grow in the shade, but we also know that oftentimes we get high yielder things and if they get more full sun. So here, and we know that this area is south, north, and I was east, wait, right? Am I right on that? East, west,
Yes.
south, north, right. So we're getting really great exposure. You know, we have this tree providing some shade to the area. Maybe it can work. Maybe in this situation, and I know that there's been a lot of conversations about this tree and whether to take it down. And I can see that there was another tree that was taken down to open up some more light. And you know, what are all the considerations? It might be a problem because there's shade, but maybe, you know, all day after working in the annual garden, we want to work in the perennial garden and we like a little shade while we work. And we know that there's a lot of things that can grow in the shade. So just what are we thinking about and what is informing our decisions? So I think that as far as we're gonna, okay, so we have pathways of circulation, we have light, we have soil. How does the soil look? What is going on with it? We know a little bit about the history of what's been here, and all of those things are helping. We also know it could be a little dry, it's still early in the morning, it's getting a lot of light. What else? What other things have I said, or do you guys already know that are considerations that would be designing our zones around? Any ideas? How about wind? Something that we often don't think about, but it really impacts different plants. Like I currently work at a nursery where we get a lot of wind. And what that means is that I have to water a lot more. And so I'm thinking about where am I putting my plants? Am I having to drag the bucket of water 50 feet every day, or am I going to put the things that need more water right next to my water source? You know, it's like, so these are the considerations. So light, wind, pathways of circulation, air.
That sort of adds up to microclimates, recognizing
Yes, exactly.
microclimates.
Yep. Yeah. And even on one site, 2 acres can feel really small to some people, and then once you start working with it, it all of a sudden feels really huge because there are microclimates that are existing in so many different pockets. And, you know, it's just incredible. And another thing that will contribute to those microclimates is, of course, is water. So where does water collect? Where does it flow to? Where does it come from? You know, how can we get the flow to be going to the plant's roots, basically, is what we're thinking with that one. So these are all the considerations. So in this site, we're going to do some planting, and ideally we can get this whole area planted today. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the different plants, and if anyone is like anxious to like, you know what, I just need to do something, I just need to dig, just let me know. You know, we can absolutely, if you want to do something as you listen, that's fine too. But what I was going to do is go over the plants that we have here, why we have them, and then talk about, and together as a group, of course I have an idea, and I've been working with Elizabeth thinking about species and what's needed and where it can be, and then, so I have an idea of where things are going to go, but I'm also curious as to what you guys think, because I think that'll add more to your learning today. So here we have some plants, and we have more that we're going to actually put in this area. And we're going to create some diversity in height, in form, in function, in beauty, in edibility. So in drawing insectaries, in accumulating nutrients. So for a lot of these things, we're already at 7. And that was just off the top of my head. If I opened a couple books and looked up some more information about these plants, we could probably get to 10. Because there's a lot of uses for these things too, medicinal and otherwise. So the considerations for just this one site, if we're just going to observe the site, we see that there's stumps. And so what do we know about what's happening underneath the soil if we see stumps?
The roots are degrading,
That's right.
deteriorating, yeah.
And what does it take to degrade or to break down the roots?
Nitrogen, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So what we know is that because these stumps are here and they're decomposing, they need nitrogen to decompose. So we want to think about putting some nitrogen fixers here already. So that's one thing that will inform our decision. Anything that can inform our decision, because it's hard to make these decisions, right? We need some kind of a framework. So nitrogen fixers. So we have nasturtium is actually I've heard it does a mild effective nitrogen fixing. Okay. Yeah, we're going to be picking and pulling. So maybe if you want to pull a couple of things that are maybe nitrogen fixing.
We have some fava beans here.
Yeah. So seeding. So we're going to establish plants, but you can also, like I said, in nature we don't ever see bare soil. I always plant things in pockets. I'm like, oh look, there's another pocket. Good, I can put this in, or oh, I can put that in, and and that's the fun of it. Because really, as landscapers, we're sculptors. We're really sculpting the landscape, right? So
Clover. We also have red clover seed.
okay, great. So we're gonna probably that was one thing. So it's the first observation. I was like, okay, we have stumps. That means that we have nitrogen being used up. That means we need to make sure it comes here. So the other things that I'm thinking about is that this is a pathway and that the south is that way. And oftentimes when we design, we want to do so in such a way that is above the soil, where we're mimicking nature. And also, just quickly, the other aspect about this site is that it's on the edge, right? And what we know about edges is that they're some of the most diverse areas. So we're on the edge of this forest. And this edge is the flow and relationship between the wild forest and the cultivated landscape, which is ideal because anytime we want to build soil, sometimes all you need to do is get a handful from a really nice diverse area and mix it in. And like what Carl was talking about as far as those inoculants go, there's a lot of inoculant in that natural forest soil. So maybe we'll do that today, why not? But you just want to be careful that I never actually take things out of the forest that's like, larger than a handful of soil. Because the system there is in balance, right? We don't want to start getting involved too much. Like, you never want to, I've heard of people like, oh, leaves we know is an incredible mulch. And it's in such abundance in the forest. And God, that they don't need all of those leaves. But there's other areas to rake the leaves. Don't go into the forest and rake the leaves. That creates all the forest duff. But you just got to keep yourself in check with how you're working with these systems and whether it's going to encouraging balance or not encouraging balance. And that's an easy way to think about that fork in the road. Okay, so we know we're going to do some nitrogen fixers. We know that we're going to do those in the form of seeds and potentially transplanted clover. So we're thinking about the soil and we're thinking about maximizing the benefit. Because we're on the edge, what you don't want to do is put something like a really tall thing here and then shorter things here. Although in this circumstance it could be okay because there's a path. But I was thinking that this might be a nice area to go from lower things to taller things. And our design incorporates what's already existing. So, and that's often what we think about as permaculture too. Like we have our microclimate system. We have where I'm working right now. We have the context of where I'm working in this space. We have the context of this space within this landscape. We have the context of this landscape within this neighborhood. And we have the context of this neighborhood within this town. And you could see all the layers. So it's not that you have to become, neurotic about thinking about those things, but it's a consideration because permaculture is about building whole systems. And we can't think about any one part within the system independently of the system itself. So that's why Birdie's design was on the map on the wall or Birdie's house, because it was like, oh, we have to contextualize this. We have to think about these things. And oh, there's a park over there and people are going to be walking through and so you all just think, that microcosm and that macrocosm relationship is really wonderful. Okay, so we're thinking about some height. We have some elderberries. Is everyone familiar with the elderberry? Such a beautiful plant. Nature is just provides these gifts. It's incredible. It's a really great medicine. It's really wonderful for the pollinators, and it can create a nice hedge. And anytime, there's a lot of things that I might talk about today that you can create hedges. And I like that because if you have a lot of wind on your site, you want to think about, okay, how can we be mitigating and moving and you know, decreasing the negative effects of this wind. And so anytime you use a hedge that's a food-based or edible hedge, it's called a fedge. So we're going to be talking about fedges a little bit. So we have some elderberries, and you know, so those are going to get anywhere between 5 and 8 feet tall. We also have some aronia, which is a choke cherry. Who's interested in the birds? Aronia is a really great plant that brings all the birds. And same with herbs, like perennial herbs. If you don't end up harvesting them, what they do is they create organic matter because they get big, and you can use that organic matter to help build your soil. And any berries that you don't harvest can go to the birds. And often it's good to watch the birds because they're the first ones that know when things are ripe. And so it just depends on if you want to have high yields or if your goals are to maximize your habitat. Those are other things. So here we have some rose rugosa that Elizabeth just brought down. And this will also really help to draw the bees, to draw the pollinators. As we know, over 90% of our food is grown by pollination. And so anything that we can do to increase the habitat of the bees. We were talking a little bit about the dandelion, and it's the same thing with anything that's flowering really early. I don't care what it is, I always leave it. I do some gardening at the school garden at White River. We have a lot of wild cress, and it's one of the first things to flower. And then it gets really big and leggy, and when I'm ready to go in and put in my annuals or my other plants, then I pull it. So it's just, you know, it doesn't mean you have to live with all of these wild flowers, but because cress, it ends up getting big, and I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to put in something else. So it's that you think about those types of things.
The ajuga and pulmonary
Yeah.
are good early bloomers to bring the bees there and keep
Yep.
them there.
And we also have some other functions. Ajuga is a beautiful ground cover. The bees love it. It's very hardy. And what was the other one?
Pulmonaria.
Oh, pulmonaria, which is lungwort. So, and that's a beautiful, shade-loving, early blooming. We're always looking for shade stuff because it's really hard to find a site that just has 100% sun. And we don't even really want that actually. So, so yeah, and we can. I would love to hear what plants you guys love to use, you know, or what are things that you want to learn more about, or and why. And we can talk a lot about all of those things. So we have height variance. We're going to build a little fedge. We're going to plant the roses for the bees, for the medicinal properties of the rose hips, and for its great ability to really, it's a nice companion plant for any fedge. And to make tea. Yeah. So then we have elderberry, rose rugosa, aronia, which is, it's a high antioxidant berry. It needs to be processed a little bit before it tastes really good. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be planted because it's good for humans and habitat. And then we have a lot of herbs. And a lot of the herbs have been chosen because they are either insectivores by drawing pollinators. They're beautiful by producing flowers. They're edible. They're good companion plants by drawing things like the bracken wasp that eats the aphids. They're edible. They spread. To, like, for instance, I'm looking at, we have over in this corner, we have garden sorrel, which is, you know, we used to see it a lot in cottage gardens because it's a beautiful perennial. It produces a nice big leaf that's actually I've had one of the most amazing soups in my life was a fresh garden sorrel soup, and it's just so underused. So we have big leaves. It can help fall to the ground, create some mulch. We can harvest it. We can get multiple harvests 1 year off of it. It's just incredible. So what we have here is things from seeds, which are not even in the ground yet, so they're like the lowest layer, to the herbs that kind of are creating. So even within this movement with low to high, we're also thinking, this is why permaculture is so awesome, because we're also thinking that same principle is applied to this climate. You guys, so there's this little microclimate, and there's within the context of the larger microclimate.
When you're talking about these things, could you just point to them?
Yes, sure, absolutely. This is oregano, salad burnet or burnet. I don't know. Does anyone else? How do you pronounce it? I think it's burnet. German chamomile, fennel, dill. This is orange mint, which I'm excited about. It's a new mint, and I just couldn't see this orange house without orange mint. and it kind of has this vining effect. Actually, I was kind of thinking of these on top of the, and then the garden sorrel and Good King Henry.
Where is the garden sorrel?
Okay.
These right here.
Right
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, right here.
In fact,
Yeah, yeah, and take a leaf and try it. Who hasn't tried garden sorrel before? Yeah, so it's really good. And then Good King Henry is one of those, and it looks very similar. I think it's the one in the front. And that is a really medicinal plant. You can eat the edible shoots, you can eat the flower, you can eat all aspects of it. So the shoots come up and it gets big, and it's kind of like an early asparagus.
What was your source for Good King Henry?
I'm sorry?
What was your source for Good King Henry?
Riker's herbs out of Canada. Yeah, they're really beautiful. And then Henderson's. I'm also the nursery manager at Henderson's Tree and Garden Services, where our focus this year is all these things. So yeah. So but and we got a lot of stuff, wholesale from Riker's, which is if you're looking for kind of like rare, beautiful, they ship all over the country. They do a really good job. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what we needed for our design considerations as nitrogen fixers and thinking about height. So what else would we think about? Okay, so we're gonna start placing plants and digging holes. What else do we need to think about before we? Oh, and I'm sorry, I can't forget to mention borage. This is an incredible plant. It doesn't look like that much, especially when it's growing from seed, but it is probably like one of the best companion plants out there. It has nitrogen fixing properties. It's a self-seeding biennial. It has these beautiful little blue flowers that draw all of the beneficials. And it's an old cottage garden plant. I love to plant it with calendula just because the colors look really good together, and it's just a wonderful plant. So that's borage or borage. Everyone pronounces plants different, and I love it. I'm like, great, what is the dialect for this plant? It's awesome. So, okay, so what else? What do you guys think? I'm gonna place a couple plants and maybe you guys can tell me why we made that decision, and think about what else we're gonna plant in here. Can you tell that I teach kids too? Because we're all gonna have to work together today.
I would also say the conditions of the soil.
Uh-huh.
So we know that this soil here is all new and clean soil.
Yeah.
But the area that we're going to plant the berries is sort of questionable. The soil that was here before that hasn't been tested. So I wouldn't necessarily put the sorrel in a spot that I wasn't sure was good for eating.
Yep.
But things that are maybe higher up for the harvest.
So is this soil hasn't been amended at all?
This soil in the front has. Actually, we're standing on a hugel mound.
Yeah.
This was all built up with stumps underneath and new soil, but where it cuts off right here, back here, this was all kind of existing.
Okay.
So this is all fill.
And when did you start the hugel mound?
This was last year.
And there's some examples of some growing hugel mounds here too, if people want to see them.
How much does that, well, you haven't done it, but how much does it settle over time?
So it did settle a little bit, and we just cut through to make these steps and found that it was decomposing really nicely and the soil was really rich. So it's definitely an experiment, but...
I mean, is it likely
so
to become a sunken garden from your walkway, or?
No, it's really maintained its height, I'd say, pretty well. There were a few pockets that we had to fill in a little more, but it's
I know
definitely...
often on construction sites, suddenly you'll see in the middle of something.
Some of which we don't understand why, right? I don't know why that's clumped like that. So I have been really into planting things in triangles and in angles, because that's a pattern in nature that we see when the tree is branching. You see the branching. We know that that's the way that our lungs are built. We know that is also the easiest path for nutrients to flow. So when we're planting things in those Y patterns, it adds for creativity for the garden and the gardener. It increases nutrient flow of how it might be moving around, and it keeps things out of rows. which some things rows are really good for, like for ease of harvesting and doing yields, like, you know, but you don't always, so you just have to know where that system should go. But, so we're gonna talk a little bit about that kind of patterning. Does that help to answer some of your questions? A little bit. Oh,
I was
spacing.
thinking particularly about
Of course.
marshmallow and things like that. I mean, I certainly have a lot on my land.
Yeah.
And I don't wonder how close I want it to
So
be.
anything,
Marigold or marshmallow?
marshmallow.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an herb, it's an expectorant, it's a beautiful flower, it produces a lot of biomass. So with that kind of thing, I would think about height and spread. And like sometimes you need to stake your mallow. I don't know if you do, but I've seen it, you know, like I've had to stake a lot of mallow before because it gets so tall. So anything that's really tall, you know, and I push spacing. You know, in the traditional, you know, you might say like, okay, 5 to 8 feet or 4 to 8 feet or something. I'm like, I really want to try 3 feet. And then, you know, maybe you need top feed, so make sure it's getting enough nutrients. But because we're a part of the system, we're learning from it, we're experimenting with it. So anything that's tall, I would say your spacing should be like, you know, 4 to 6 feet. And then as you get smaller, you know, you think about, you know, and I'm no mathematician, but I really am intrigued by ratios. And if you have certain space within your plantings, you might just be maximizing the ratio for a number of different things. So I just kind of go with my aesthetic. And like as a gardener, our energy is built into a system, right? So people will have different aesthetics, and that's fine. It keeps the world beautiful, right? So work with your own aesthetic a little bit, and just know that the plant that's larger than yourself will require, you know, 4 feet.
Or Simon.
And the other, right, and maybe Simon would have a different, anyone that's really tall might have a different aesthetic. And, you know, we don't need to, like, I'm, you know, shorter, so it's like, I want to be able to reach things. I'm not going to put anything, I'm not going to build a garden bed that's more than 4 feet wide, because I know I can't reach all of that space. So then, but that also brings up a good point. So the way to think about the nutrients in the tree, like how far a tree is getting its nutrients from, because yeah, we could have a guild and I could say, okay, there's some mallow over there and that might help this tree. But another nice thing that's helpful is to think about half the tree's height on the ground is basically a general rule around where it's getting its nutrients from. So that helps.
Half its height at any given time in its life.
At any given time in its life.
You need to think as far ahead as how tall it will be.
That's right. That's right.
I sort of, well, since I'm doing most of my building in existing yards or whatever, each year extend a ring of hay, mulch hay, out another leaf
Yes.
layer all the way around, and then
Yes.
you can add things into that as it
Yes.
rots down.
Absolutely.
So you're extending it. You don't, if you think your tree's going to grow 20 feet tall, you don't want to start with a 10-foot
Exactly.
radius ring.
And then you're also growing with your landscape.
Yeah.
And so what Barbara was just saying, I want to make sure everyone heard, is that like, you know, you plant your tree and maybe it's either already dug up, or maybe you dig up the sod, or maybe you do mulch, or maybe you do sheet mulching. You know, you can create it's like 3 feet in diameter, and then, you know, and that's basically what you have for time that year, and it's what's needed for the tree. So check, right? And then the next year, your perennials are growing, they're expanding, you need space for them. You know, maybe in the fall, you add, you know, another foot or 2 around your mulch ring. And then, by the next season, it's ready for planting. So you're thinking about least impact for greatest effect. And that's a wonderful example, because the first year, you only need nutrients to be this far, and then it's going to grow and grow and grow, as with the tree, as your gardens will. And as our dependence on fossil fuel decreases, right? So now we have more food for ourselves too. There's like win, 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 win. So it's awesome. Okay, so for here we've got these pioneer species. We've already decided we're not going to plant any things aside from what's in that corner that is directly edible. And by that I mean like no salad greens, right? And especially things not like mustard or spinach, because we know that those are actually sometimes used as bioremediators, which means that they can pull things up from the soil. But what does that also mean?
The soil gets cleaner.
It means the soil gets cleaner, but what else
There's a disposal problem of what are you going to do with the spinach?
There's a disposal problem, yep. And then, but what does it also tell us about things like spinach?
Oh, they're full of the nutrition that they pull up?
Yeah, Exactly. So like when you plant a plant like that, you can think about planting it in an area that you don't want to pull the nutrition, but if you have incredible soil, then plant your crops that are going to really do a good job, because just like the symbiotic bacteria can bring the nitrogen from the air into the soil, similarly the plants can bring the nutrients from the soil up and into our bodies, and that's like ideal, right?
So what are some other examples?
Of
Like besides spinach and
spinach, sunflowers, what else?
Now does chard do as well?
Those are the main ones that I know for bioremediation, but there's lots of
Does
information.
chard do as well as spinach? Because I don't grow spinach because we eat too much of it and it's gone.
Yeah, chard.
So we do something that's
It doesn't.
replaced
It's
so
not
much.
known for its bioremediation because it's chard is Beta vulgaris. It's in the beet family,
Right.
so it's a different family. But you know, maybe things that are similar in that family would do.
I wonder about lamb's quarter. It's natural and it's so similar to spinach, and it is like
Yeah,
in areas that need.
yeah. Yeah, lamb's quarter is in the Chenopodium family, which is also the same family as quinoa. So it does do a lot of dynamic accumulation and bioremediation, and yeah, I probably would not be eating it if it was growing in a lot of areas that I felt like there was toxicity. But lamb's quarter, just speaking about some things that really occur naturally and for such great reasons, lamb's quarter does something, and it draws an early aphid. It's called the black aphid. And what it does is then when that appears, it also brings the ladybugs. So before a lot of your crops are growing, where you have the most, we often see the green aphid, everyone probably recognizes that. By having the lamb's quarter, if it draws the black aphid, it also draws all the beneficials. So when they show up on your other crops, the ladybugs will already be there, right? So it's just, again, balance, natural. It's nice to know those things, you know? Maybe. Is it a black little bug? Sure. Probably is a black aphid. Does anyone know?
Lamb quarter? Oh.
Also, I'm looking at the
Are they-
burdock over here. I gather the burdock
Yes.
is also
Are they
good for
aphids?
remediation,
I don't know.
It is.
Eggs.
Yep.
as is
There's some one guy's moving. The rest look like eggs.
Well, anything, I mean, it's like, everything is drawing nutrients, right? So so for burdock is a medicine, but you want to make sure to not harvest it in an area where it might be bringing up the minerals to the surface, you know? You might not want to do that. Jerusalem artichokes. Does everyone know about Jerusalem artichokes? An incredible plant. Having something that I don't have to plant every year and it just grows.
That we're gonna put somewhere
So
else.
the stalks are hollow. They can be
That's
used
a
as
good
straws if you want to do some fun activities with kids. It can be used as like a salad garnish or any kind of savory dish.
yeah, in terms of guild work and stuff. I mean, what does it bring to the table?
It brings some height. It brings some shade. I can't remember if it's a dynamic accumulator. It's funny, if you guys know Dave Jackie, he wrote the Edible Forest Garden series, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Must have.
From Chelsea Green.
Also available from Chelsea Green. And you look at the dynamic accumulator list, and there are so many. You know, so everything, like I say, everything takes up nutrients, but I can't remember if it's one grown for that purpose. So its height, its form, its function, that's kind of what I think about it. It's an interesting foliage, so it adds some aesthetic. Yep. I'm gonna put the tags in here. You can choose to take them out if you want, but just so in case you forget what any is or whatever.
Karen, how are you thinking about the tape? Now we're at 10 minutes after 12.
Yeah, so if anyone has to go, they can go, or if anyone wants to get their hands in the dirt to do some digging, maybe what would be nice is for us to accomplish just like the planting that's happening right here in this area. But don't feel obligated, and then why don't we transition and... Oh, I guess we could break.
Thank you, Karen.
Yay! Thank you. Yeah, I hope you learned something, and you know, keep gardening and growing. And Carl is instigating this permaculture circle, so even if you don't come to the meetings, but you have information you want, or questions you have, or something you want to share, you know, be in touch, and happy growing.